Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I wasn't quite expecting to chair. I was actually expecting to make some comments as a discussant. So I was wondering if I could pass that baton on to somebody else.
Sure, I'm happy to welcome you all. Thank you so much for tuning into this session. We'll be speaking about Southern Africa in a global history of science. How as a region, South Africa has both been crucially important in global understandings of the sciences, and yet how very often it's been written out of the picture, or Southern African peoples have been written out of the picture. And we're going to be speaking about many different historical time periods. And yeah, I'll begin if that's okay. I'll speak about the early modern globalization of the sciences in Southern Africa, and the role of Southern Africa in this key moment of globalization. Okay, let's see. Is it full screen? Yeah. Okay. So, on the 31st of May, 1685, a French embassy destined for the East Indies disembarked at the Dutch colony at the Cape of Good Hope. And this delegation was part of an effort by the Académie des Sciences to foster the improvement of and curiosity of the arts and sciences, the exactness of geography, and the surer establishment of navigation. Its Jesuit participants, some of whom would remain in Siam, and the rest of whom would continue northeast to the Qing Empire, China, planned both to collect what was called Chinese knowledge and to make their own empirical observations throughout the journey. As French Catholics, there was substantial apprehension about staying in a Dutch Protestant colony. However, the missionaries, as they did in so many other places, used their astronomical skills as a political tool. The Jesuits offered the Cape settlers important astronomically derived geographical information, such as, and I quote, the assured longitude of the Cape of Good Hope, that they, the settlers, do not know but for their estimates. In exchange for this geographical information, the Cape commander, Simon van der Stel, offered us a place in every way proper for observing. At the same time, he ordered that a pavilion in the company garden be made ready for us to lodge in. The missionaries used this temporary accommodation and this observatory as a pretext for engaging with the indigenous Khoikhoi population at the Cape, whom the Jesuits had been banned from proselytizing. And in classic Jesuit fashion, Father Guy Tachard, who was one of these French Jesuits on this embassy, wrote that the Khoikhoi, and I quote, convinced that there is no other life, do only what is necessary to pass this one quietly. They maintain that this manner of life shows that they are the true owners of this country and the happiest of men, since they alone live in peace and freedom. And in that, they say, consists their happiness, end quote. Tachard described his own encounter with the Khoikhoi at the observatory. He said, and I quote, when we were in the company's garden, one of their chiefs, seeing the friendliness of the Dutch chiefs, came to the observatory and meeting with the French Father Fontanet, presented him with 2 oranges, wishing in this manner to indicate the joy that their nation had at our arrival. And Tachard added, they are said to be astrologers and herbalists, and reliable persons assured us that they know the sky very well, and that they can distinguish simples, even at night, by touch and by smell. So this engraving you see here by Pieter Kolb in his widely account read of the Cape, Caput Bonae Spe Hodiernum, which drew in part on Tachard's ethnographic observations, shows that the heavens played a really crucial role in shaping Khoikhoi cultural practices. And indeed, Kolb went so far as to link the Khoikhoi to ancient Jewish populations, as both groups, as he argued, arranged their time and especially their festivals according to the new and full moon. And there's a wealth of more recent material culture evidence and sources revealing the complexity of indigenous Southern African cosmologies. So this is a 19th century painting by a San interlocutor, Cabo, but we can speak more about this later in the Q&A. So when this account of this French embassy was published in Paris in 1686, it was accompanied by a series of copperplate engravings illustrating the nature, landscapes, and peoples from this voyage to Siam. And by far the most illuminating illustration, I think, is this engraving marking the start of Book 2 that depicts the temporary observatory the Jesuits set up in the Dutch Company Gardens. The image shows this Cape Observatory with unquestionably East Asian architectural features. And the image, of course, reflects, at least in part, an exoticized, orientalized view of Southern Africa produced in the mind of two French and Flemish engravers who'd never left Europe. But its Chineseness speaks to these connections that were being hypothesized in this key moment of global connections. So this presentation, I want to ask, how does Southern Africa fit into early modern European narratives of the globalization of knowledge? The indigenous inhabitants of the Cape possessed sophisticated cosmologies and origin myths that required explanation, thought the Jesuits. So what resources did Jesuits and other European travelers reach to when dealing with unfamiliar natures, peoples at the Cape? I would suggest that they seem to be looking at the Cape through an Asian lens, and the Cape allows us to therefore complicate common binary narratives of early modern intercultural encounter, which is so often framed in global history of science as the encounter between Europe and some other. So this project, what I want to try and do is look at this crucial yet overlooked part of the early modern world to see that writing global accounts of the sciences, several early modern Europeans were making surprising new connections, essentially interpreting the unfamiliar in Southern Africa through an Asian lens. And despite very real connections between Southern Africa and the Indies, not least through the fact that a quarter of the enslaved population of the Cape was from Southeast Asia, several European writers exaggerated Southern Africa's Asianness, simultaneously appropriating Southern African natures and indigenous knowledges into then global accounts of a deep history of knowledge and erasing Southern African indigenous agency in the process. So ever since the 1490s, Southern Africa had become an integral part of European commercial visions of the East Indies. So in 1652, on the Dutch East India Company's command, Jan van Riebeck was sent from Batavia, the East Indies, to establish a port colony at the Cape of Good Hope. This colony was to serve as a refreshment station for Dutch ships traveling between Europe and the East Indies, and settlers were immediately tasked with establishing a garden to grow fresh fruit and vegetables for weary sailors. The company gardens became a space where settlers with an agricultural background experimented growing plants from all over the Dutch overseas empire. And a wide array of Dutch atlases published in the second half of the 17th century tended to mark the Cape as the westernmost part of the East Indies, as this map by Peter Goos, it's titled The Western Part of the East Indies, and it starts at the Cape. We see this also with Johannes van Keulen's new map, sea map of the East Indies. So while the early modern Cape is recognized as a crucial space for historians to make sense of the Dutch East India Company's commercial networks, it remains largely overlooked by global historians of the early modern sciences. So a good starting point for us to begin exploring how Southern African natural and human histories were explained using Asian resources is by looking at the Jesuit Louis Lecomte's memoirs on the current state of China from 1696. Strikingly, Lecomte reported that some Europeans believed that, and I quote, "the Chinese, long before the birth of our Lord, had sailed all the seas of the Indies and discovered the Cape of Good Hope," end quote. Why would Europeans think that? Well, like most Jesuits in China, Lecomte would have been familiar with Luo Hongxian's Guangyutu map, this enlarged terrestrial atlas, which contained a woodcut print of what at least superficially looked like Southern Africa. In fact, it wasn't, and we can speak more about that later. But this map circulated prolifically among Jesuits in China, and given that it referred back to a parent map from around 1320, it makes sense that missionaries in Europe imagined that the Chinese had reached the Cape before Europeans had. This extraordinary claim established a direct historical connection between the ancient Chinese and contemporary Southern Africans, raising an array of questions that early modern scholars would have been deeply concerned with regarding influence, migration, and the diffusion of knowledge by ancient go-betweens. And following Lecomte, several European descriptions of unfamiliar indigenous Southern African knowledges and practices fell back on increasingly familiar Asian categories and frameworks. Such categories, which had the effect of explaining away indigenous Southern African knowledge traditions as Asian, made sense to the Europeans proposing them, given the possibility of a historical genealogical connection between China and Southern Africa. So a salient case, brief case we can touch on, where Europeans applied an Asian lens to explain Southern African knowledge, is the identification of kanna, this plant in this watercolor painting. So kanna grows in the northwestern regions of Southern Africa and has long been consumed by the Namakwa, an indigenous group from nearby today's Namibia, as a relief for hunger, thirst, and pain, and as a mind-altering substance for spiritual purposes. And this plant was observed growing in its natural habitat by several expeditions to the northwest of Southern Africa in the 1680s. The notebooks describing these expeditions were accompanied by watercolor paintings by the Silesian apothecary Hendrik Claudius, and described the use and properties of this plant. So a note accompanying this painting said, "This herb is only found in the Namakwa's country and on some of their mountains and is gathered in October. Called kanna by them, it's highly esteemed among us. They chew both stem and root almost all day and thereby becoming intoxicated, so that on account of this effect and its pleasant smell and stimulating taste, one may safely expect some effect from its workings." But this plant was not simply accepted by Europeans as a Southern African plant on Southern African terms, known by the Namakwas. Rather, Tachard tried to make sense of kanna with a much more familiar Asian plant. So the French Jesuit Tachard reproduced an account of an inland expedition describing this plant, and Tachard said, and I quote, "This is apparently the famous plant that the Chinese call ginseng, since Mr. Claudius, who has seen it in China, assures us that he found 2 plants of it at the Cape and showed us the complete picture of it, which he had painted from nature." And even some decades, this is Claudius' painting of the Namakwa encountered on this expedition, where he also found kanna. And even some decades later, an English edition of Peter Kolb's account of the Cape's natural and human history again equated kanna with ginseng, as we see in the caption of this image. So the unfamiliar in Southern Africa had been observed through an Asian lens and explained away using Chinese knowledge. So almost every ship traveling between Europe and Asia stopped at the Cape between the late 17th century and 1869. Southern Africa was this obligatory passage point for peoples, materials, ideas, and cosmologies during this moment of early modern globalization. And yet to date, historians of science have paid relatively little attention to it as a space of knowledge production and transformation. The Cape was an especially cosmopolitan part of the world. In addition to the indigenous Khoikhoi and San inhabitants and Dutch settlers, the Dutch East India Company brought a large number of enslaved West African and Malay laborers, further adding cultures of knowledge to this small but bustling port colony. The Cape can thus help us reorient global histories of science from focusing just on encounters between Europe and an other to appreciating this more complex, textured, and multilateral set of interactions that shaped emergent scientific knowledges and practices in the early modern world. So thank you. I think I'll leave it at that, and then happy to speak more in the questions. Thank you.
And I think that kicks it off to me, so I will just share my screen. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm going to kick off from Gianamar and take us to the 19th century. And I will continue on plants. So when the young naturalist William Burchell first rambled on Table Mountain in 1810, at every step he recognized, quote, some well-known flower which I had seen nursed with great care in the greenhouses of England. Because Burchell's father had owned the prosperous Fulham Nursery and Botanical Garden in London, he had been afforded an unparalleled opportunity in his youth to study the seeds, bulbs, and plants from around the world that passed through his father's business. He expressed that he, quote, could not for some time divest myself of feelings of regret that at every step my foot crushed some beautiful plant. explaining how difficult it is on one's first walks on the mountain, quote, to lay aside a kind of respect which one is accustomed in Europe to treat the proteas, the ericas, the pelargoniums, the creonias, and the roinas. The unique flora of the Cape had played an integral part in the burgeoning European botanical imagination since its ostensible discovery in 1488 by Portuguese navigator Bartolomeu Dias, and more memorably by the Dutch East India Company in 1652. For Burchell, in observing the variety and diversity of Cape vegetable productions in situ for the first time, he likened what he saw to, quote, a botanic garden neglected and left to grow in a state of nature. The plant groups to which Burchell refers are known as fynbos, a fire-adapted natural shrubland and heathland vegetation which occur in the Cape floristic region of South Africa, the smallest of the 6 recognized flora kingdoms. Known for its singular phytogeographic character and its high rate of endemism, the Cape floristic region has distinctive biological value as one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. Table Mountain alone has more species of plants than the whole of the British Isles. On the other hand, this area has one of the highest concentrations of endangered plant species, under threat from increasing urban expansion, invasion by exotic species, and human-induced climate change. So I'd like to highlight 3 short interrelated instances of how Cape flora was continually neglected in historical terms, which perhaps also helps us to put the historiographical neglect, of Southern Africa and its plants into some context. So firstly, Burchell was very quick to observe one conspicuous issue. Lance Van Sittert has detailed the Cape's preference for exotics. Burchell commented that the, quote, perverse nature of man's judgment to prefer whatever is distant, scarce, and difficult to be obtained, rather than was locally abundant. The carnations, hollyhocks, bassamins, tulips, and hyacinth he viewed in the Cape Gardens perhaps helped colonists feel connected to their European home and to familiar forms of scientific thinking and aesthetic refinement. Van Sittert argues that the preference for the exotic was a hallmark of botanical tastes in the British settler colonies, and the seeming indifference toward Cape flora, which colonists indiscriminately referred to as mere weeds and bossies, was frustrating and unimaginable to the visiting Burchell. The Cape's own colonists were therefore perfectly happy to pass over the Cape's indigenous flora most of the time. Secondly, it wasn't just in Southern Africa that Cape flora was neglected in the early 19th century. The longstanding interest in and circulation of Cape flora meant that by the first decades of the 19th century, the fashion for Cape plants had declined in favor of orchidilerium and a mounting interest in tropical nature. As Robert E. Kohler maintains, museums, nurseries, and botanical institutions decided that they had enough material from one region and shifted their attention to other parts of the world, even if those regions had not yet been exhaustively explored. So differing from its 18th century predecessor in its sheer dimension, naturalists now had an abundance of choice across the vegetal world to suit their intellectual interest. And so thus the distinctive fynbos of the Cape fell out of commercial favor. And thirdly, intellectual work on the Cape's vegetal productions were also abandoned at this time, only to pick back up again around the turn of the 20th century. In the first half of the 19th century, collectors Christian Eklund, Karl Zeyer, and Johann Franz Dreja oversaturated the natural history market with their extensive collections, posing both a quantitative and a qualitative challenge to the established understanding of Cape flora. The decentralization and democratization of the discipline created a flourishing community of practitioners around the world. However, botanists in the metropole had reservations about the involvement of these new classes of taxonomists, primarily because they tended to raise mere varieties to the status of species, mainly to derive prestige from introducing new names. Although they were no doubt experts in field collecting and identification, these collectors were nonetheless placed into a category allegedly prone to naming too many species, which we call splitters. But were these collectors really splitters, or were they simply just grappling with an unprecedented level of biodiversity? Metropolitan botanists who insisted on lumping excluded the potential for this biodiversity in their taxonomic categorization of Cape flora. In the same breath, because they were forced to work within the existing genera of the Linnaean taxonomic system, it left little possibility of truly understanding the biodiverse landscapes that they were trying to make sense of. These 3 instances are perhaps best encapsulated by a short example. If you Google Hypnora africana, you get a series of articles deeming it, quote, one of the world's strangest plants. Whenever I show this plant to people, the usual responses are that it's ugly, it reminds them of female genitalia, or it doesn't look like a real plant. Called kanip and kwekwegoab and found in the semi-arid regions of the Northwestern Cape and southern Namibia, Hydnora is a root hollow parasite, which means it grows completely subterranean. The rhizomes of Hydnora, called U mavumbaka, or the one that pops up in isiZulu, are used as traditional medicine to treat diarrhea, piles, acne, menstrual problems, stomach cramps, and to stop bleeding, likely due to the plant's high tannin content. While technically lying outside of the Cape floristic region, it's a testament to the diversity of plant species in Southern Africa, which offers fruitful investigations into the global history of science. The cryptic nature and seasonal appearance of Hydnora had made European encounters with the plant extremely rare, although the Kwekwe, San, Namakwa, and Zulu had long harvested this seemingly mysterious plant. When Eklund, Zaire, and Dreja flooded the market, freshly picked Hydnora specimens found their way into the hands of Robert Brown, British botanist and keeper of the Banksian Botanical Collection at the British Museum. Beginning his investigations into plant parasitism with the Sumatran parasite Rafflesia arnoldi, he put Rafflesia and Hydnora into the same frame, discussing their affinities and whether they should be classed together. British botanist William Griffith published a multi-part response questioning Brown's methodology and central premise, likewise invoking Hydnora to explain his findings. Fundamentally, he believed that parasitism alone could scarcely be used as a singular point of comparison between what he perceived as widely divergent plants. This was part of an evolving debate in taxonomy. Should naturalists keep the one character method of Linnaeus, or was it possible to use more than one morphological characteristic to differentiate when naming a new genus and species? But determining those characteristics in such a complicated process as parasitism could only be studied using live plants, or at least freshly cut ones. Ultimately, the defiance of plants like Rafflesia to submit to human endeavor contributed to the difficulty in studying the plant's parasitism and its internal structures. Zaire understood Hydnora in similar terms, as it was one among many a Cape plant which was, quote, obstinate in the first instance to submit to the treatment and wishes of man. For Brown and Griffith, the impenetrability of Rafflesia was essentially tied to their understanding of its tropical home in the Sumatran rainforest. The corpse flower, like many unusual and exotic plants, became deeply entwined with configurations and constructions of the environment. Yet botanists dwelled very little on the African landscape which gave life to Hydnora, omitting it from grandiose portrayals and popular imaginings of the idiosyncrasy of nature. It is possible because they very little about its specific ecological context. In their mind, they separated the plant from its environment. And perhaps this is part of a wider neglect of the Cape's ecological singularity. Nonetheless, in the herbarium, plants defined by their physical structure occupied a paradoxical place, inextricably tied to their home while simultaneously abstracted to help explain undefinable aspects of nature. Likewise, their resistance to travel and dramatic structural change in the drying process offered a similarly liminal space, rarely captured in their true living form beyond the root which offers their nutrients. The moment these collectors detached plants from their environment, indigenous African plants were both materially and intellectually abstracted to fit into Western notions of scientific knowledge. The difficulties that collectors and botanists experience in attempting to make sense of this African plant in European terms led them to do the same with Africans and their environment. A flower, which we now refer to as being one of the most, quote, primitive organisms in the natural world as a basal angiosperm, was seen as inextricable from the, quote, primitive humans who inhabited the continent and the, quote, impenetrable environment where they resided, helping to contribute to racialized visions of nature. If 19th century collectors and naturalists perceived floral curiosities like Hydnora as signifiers of primitivity, both plants and humans could be powerfully othered, justifying further exploitation. Plants then too became arbiters of ideology because they carried particular messages imposed on them by processes of colonialism. So how is that, considering the Cape's popularity for its singular biodiversity, coupled with the rise of non-human and multi-species histories, the vegetal landscape of Southern Africa and its ancestral caretakers have been written out of global histories of science? It seemed easy enough for historical actors to do so, as this talk has hopefully shown. Yet here we have an opportunity to use non-human resources with which to tell stories about Southern Africa, which aren't represented in the archive or in current global histories of science. one which is inclusive and illustrative of both the human and non-human diversity of the Cape. Given the importance of the non-human in African cosmologies and foundational myths, telling non-human stories can help us rehabilitate Indigenous accounts of human relationships to the environment and shed light on contemporary issues facing that environment. So in that sense, I would argue that more attention should certainly be paid to the historical potential of the Cape Floristic region's biodiversity and the ethnobotanical understanding of its flora. Thank you very much.
There we go. Thanks everyone. I guess that's my cue. So I'll be taking us to the late 19th century, and without saying anything else, I'll just get started and share my screen. All right. Okay. In 1887, the Zulu Kingdom was annexed by the British Empire and named Zululand. The Zulu Kingdom was a powerful African state, often remembered by the career of Shaka Zulu. Cattle formed the backbone of its economy, and the region had once supported vast herds of cows. Yet shortly after the imposition of imperial rule, magistrates began receiving complaints from Zulu cattle keepers about a disease called Unakane, which was anglicized as Nagana, that was decimating their livestock. The cause of the disease, Zulu pastoralists insisted, was the presence of legally protected big game animals. Magistrates, concerned about the future of the Zululand fauna, were reluctant to allow uncontrolled hunting, but could see evidence of cattle wasting away and dying in numbers. In 1894, David Bruce, a Scottish surgeon major who worked closely with his wife, Mary Bruce, was commissioned to investigate. This paper argues that although local Zulu experts were instrumental to his research, David Bruce treated Zululand as little more than a convenient point for the extraction of blood, flies, and ideas. The area served as a source of experimental animals, theories shared by local residents, and labor from interested farmers and hunters. Theories in circulation among Zulu residents provided the foundations for Bruce's research and shaped his experimental design. Yet Bruce's work provided little relief for suffering farmers and cattle in the region. His research was excellently received by his peers, and he received numerous honors and prizes. However, even though the colonial government expected Bruce to find a cure for the disease and a preventative remedy, he succeeded in neither, devoting almost no attention to Nagana treatment in his 3 years of research. So in 1894, David and Mary Bruce arrived in Ubombo, a tiny settlement atop the Lebombo mountain range. David Bruce depicted Ubombo as an extremely isolated frontier, claiming that the arrival of Mary and himself had doubled its population from 2 to 4. This headcount ignored Black people within the region, who Bruce did not consider to be a part of the population. Nevertheless, the region was isolated from centers of scientific research. Even establishing contact with the capital, Pietermaritzburg, took nearly 2 weeks. Part of the reason for this slow transport system was the presence of tsetse flies in the lowlands. Tsetse flies are small biting insects that feed on any kind of vertebrate blood they can get their proboscis into. In the 1890s, many European naturalists believed them to be venomous to cattle. Although these flies abounded Zululand, Ubombo was believed to be healthy and fly-free. Here, the Bruce couple established a makeshift laboratory and traveled into the nearby low country to collect specimens of fly, big game blood, infected animals, as well as local Zulu theories of Nagana. Collected blood, flies, and ideas were then carried up the mountain and tested in a series of experiments. Right from the outset, the Bruces began collecting local etiologies in the region. David learned, likely from magistrates who had been investigating the matter since 1891, that 3 local theories existed, which magistrate Frank Cardew had racialized as follows. Firstly, the European theory that the fly injects a deadly poison into livestock that is harmless to humans and wildlife. Secondly, the so-called native theory that big game, meaning large wild animals, spread the disease when their saliva came into contact with livestock. And lastly, that what they called malarial fever in unhealthy tracts of land was the immediate cause of disease. In adopting this tripartite categorization of theories in Zululand, David Bruce homogenized numerous competing theories that had been developed by African experts and made them stand for each group. There was, in reality, no hard line between the so-called native and European theories. European hunters and doctors, such as David Livingstone, admitted that their knowledge about tsetse flies and the diseases they spread had in fact come from Southern African experts. David Livingstone and William Oswell, for example, wrote that their guide Chombo had led them through a fly belt at night time when the flies were inactive so as to avoid their deadly bites. Livingstone added that at times they would coat cattle in a mixture of cow dung, herbs, and milk to create a viscous coating that repulsed the fly. Other Southern Africans drew direct connections between tsetse fly, big game, and livestock disease. Hunter David Leslie wrote that Unokane was, and I quote, the Zulu name for the tsetse, end quote, and that cattle kept in proximity to zebra would die. By 1891, magistrates in Zululand reported a third theory among Zulu cattle keepers, that the saliva of big game was infecting their cattle with Nagana and that it spread at shared water and grazing sources. Such evidence reveals that there was not a single so-called native theory on Nagana, but a diversity of views on the problem which went back decades. Such accounts also indicate that the so-called European theory was in fact a composite of African views that Europeans had published. Although Bruce reproduced these theories in his reports, he nevertheless wished to distance them from his own work and dismissed their evidence as, and I quote again, not very trustworthy. Now, despite this strong critique, David and Mary Bruce actually spent much time testing these theories experimentally. The couple commenced the investigation with an inspection of the blood of infected animals via a microscope. Here they found not a poison, but swarms of blood parasites later named trypanosomes. To trace the life cycle of the parasite, the couple began investigating all of the environmental elements that the African theories had pathologized: fly, big game, and water or herbage. After 3 years of periodic research, the couple synthesized these theories with contemporary strands in bacteriology, arguing that the bite of the tsetse fly transmitted the parasite from unhealthy to healthy animal, and that big game animals should harbor the parasite without any impact on their health. Although the Bruce's findings were a terrible indictment against big game, they were reluctant to make policy recommendations. The couple only suggested that to control the disease, one could develop a vaccine or serum or strike it at its origin, without ever explaining what this origin was. However, they devoted almost no attention to such curative measures during their stay in Ubombo. David and Mary made a handful of attempts at curing the disease with arsenic, quinine, and serotherapy, all with no success. And when farmers brought them sick cattle, the couple was as likely to simply dismiss the case as uncurable, use the animal for further experiments, or use it as bait to capture flies in the lowlands. Despite failing to find a cure, in 1897, the Bruce couple decided to abandon their research. All of their livestock and their pet dog were withering and dying from Nagana at Ubombo. David wrote that, quote, Ubombo had lost its character as a healthy experimental station. It was now a part of the fly country. As such, they left. Despite all this, David Bruce's 3 reports, published in 1895, 96, and 1903, were ultimately regarded as significant bacteriological discoveries, and David received numerous honors. Yet locals in Zululand were less impressed. One white farmer called J. Young wrote that David had never cured a single animal of any kind, and he could in fact only be deemed an expert on killing animals. For local bureaucrats, the couple had found neither a vaccine nor a cure and not offered any pointers for policy. Ultimately, although the investigation failed to provide much help to the region, it marked the first point at which a European explicitly claimed to have discovered the true cause of Nagana. As such, in David's honor, the disease-causing parasite was named Trypanosoma brucei. Now, although nobody could deny this was an important piece of bacteriological work, part of the reason for David Bruce's acclaim was the mythology that he and his supporters constructed surrounding his investigation. He and his supporters framed him and Mary Bruce as frontier bacteriologists, working almost entirely alone in a backward region. As a result of such publicity, protozoologist Charles Wenyon believed that he and Mary Bruce, quote, worked alone without help in Zululand, end quote. Yet this mythology was largely a product of the erasure of Zulu experts living in the area. David Bruce's academic work omitted the critical information provided by Zulu experts beyond the so-called native theory he dismissed as untrustworthy and the labor infrastructures that enabled the extraction of blood, flies, and ideas. Yet his experiment books and photographs reveal that not only did Zulu people provide the theories that kickstarted the investigation, they also served as an important source of manual labor without which no work could have taken place. Zulu guides, hunters, cooks, and porters were particularly important in a series of shooting operations where specimens of game blood were collected during his search for trypanosomes. These men, named Polige, Kautolo, Mbanjo, Makula, and Ngazane, were pejoratively labeled as gun boys in his personal photo album. They likely had extensive knowledge of wildlife and tracking in the field. The Bruces likewise employed at least 20 carriers to transport specimens from the lowlands to Ubombo. Finally, the Bruces were assigned 2 personal bodyguards, both of them Zulu. Clearly, the couple did not work alone without help in a completely isolated landscape with a population of 2. Zulu experts were as indispensable to field collection as they were to theorization. They were employed as hunters, carriers, informants, bodyguards, cooks, and data collectors. So to conclude, Bruce's investigation at Ubombo was, in some ways, a classic case of extractive research in which the importance of Zulu expertise was filtered out and forgotten. The research proved important to tropical medicine, providing the bacteriological foundations for subsequent studies of African trypanosomiasis. David Bruce made a career out of it, which led to numerous honors, including a knighthood. However, this success was ultimately a result of a process of appropriation and erasure, in which the instrumental role of Zulu experts was filtered out through publication, circulation, and colonial mythologies. Zulu intellectual and physical contributions to Bruce's investigations were instead relegated to the category of the native theory, bifurcated from the sciences and rapidly forgotten. In this way, the disease was anglicized, becoming Nagana rather than Unakane, and the early history of trypanosomiasis became associated with Bruce and not the countless numbers of Southern African farmers and hunters who had provided the foundations for his research. Thank you very much for listening. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. And we'll hear from Professor Isabel Hofmeyr in just a minute, but let me just add that for the audience, you can ask questions using the Q&A function, the Q&A button. Yeah.
Okay. Just to say, this connection is a bit unstable, so it might sort of be a bit choppy. Wave if it sort of breaks down completely. So firstly, just a word of thanks for the invitation to comment on these 3 gorgeous and elegant papers, which were such a pleasure to read. I'm a literary and cultural historian with an interest in the environmental humanities, living and working in South Africa, and that's broadly the context for my comments. So the papers together, I think, illustrate firstly, the manifold ways in which the complexity of South Africa's eco-imperial histories have been obscured, and secondly, how recovering these histories has the capacity to set debates on new latitudes. Now, I think together the presentations demonstrate very well how European imperialisms are really a process of elemental colonization. So where every element comes to be colonized, whether materially or intellectually, so whether stars or soil or plants or animals or water or protozoa, all of these elements are sort of translated into extractable resources in a series of processes that we might name, for example, hydrocolonialism, which I've written a bit about, phytocolonialism, lithocolonialism, etc., etc. So just to briefly recap, Catherine demonstrates how the extraordinary biodiversity of the Cape outstripped British models and was erased, as you say, as African plants were both materially and intellectually abstracted to fit into Western notions of scientific knowledge. Gian Ma shows how traveling Jesuits, confounded by the complex realization of knowledges of the Cape, quote, essentially interpreted the unfamiliar in Southern Africa through an Asian lens, part of a long and broader pattern of establishing the hierarchy of civilizations, Europe, Asia, Africa. Jules explores how the complexities of vernacular and settler knowledges are erased by ideas of heroic authorship, turning everything into a one white man show. It's on Indian Ocean studies. You also remind us that in the 17th century, the Cape was seen as lying on the outer edges of the East Indies, in effect an Indian Ocean city, which is how I think it remained until at least into the early 19th century. The paper then draws Cape Town into this different set of geographies. The paper also completely, fascinating snapshots of Jesuits passing through the Cape, and as you show, encountering forms of Khoisan expertise as a kind of, a kind of sand in the oyster around which they have to layer something else, in this case, an Asian framework, in order to cover this sort of irritant. The Jesuits, obviously, I think, presumably represent a kind of elite perspective. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you intend, extending this very wonderful project. I found particularly suggestive was this idea of the Cape at the very outer reaches of the East Indies, and drawing from Ashley Cohen's wonderful work on a book called The Global Indies, and I'll put up the link soon. I wondered whether you could do more work with the category, in fact, of the Indies itself, which he shows is such a sort of interesting and sort of ideological construction. Just a very contemporary example is this sort of endless attempt to Asianize aspects of Cape history, particularly in relation to enslaved communities, which, as you say, draw from all over, particularly West Africa and also Mozambique. But that sort of African part of the story is consistently sort of overwritten with the Southeast Asian, or, constructed as Malay. And it's again this kind of layering of civilizations, that overlays the extraordinary creolized situation at the Cape, captured wonderfully in that image of the Khoisan chief presenting 2 oranges while speaking Portuguese. So turning now to Catherine's paper, I was very fascinated by the process of abstraction, of this kind of plant stereotyping. It seemed to be a kind of phytocolonialism. And I just wondered if that term is ever used, and if not, whether you thought it could be expanded or used in some way. Here, the period you talk about is largely the early 19th century. I've sort of more interested in the later 19th century, so sort of direct my comments there. And particularly this growth of biotic borders, from Jeannie Shinazuka's work on intersection of plant, insect, and human migration and their consequences for border regimes. So the world, as the world you describe, appears to have fairly free movement of plants. But by the end of the century, this would presumably have changed with regimes of quarantine and fumigation, and the more rigid distinction of quote unquote native and foreign plants. So I've done some work on the Colonial Customs House, where the figure of the plant inspector seems to be really interesting and important in establishing these sorts of distinctions. And there's quite a nice sort of archive of the plant inspector, and I just wondered if you'd ever sort of dipped into that. So I suppose in essence, my question really is about how and when does the Cape's biodiversity come into focus? You show how it's being obscured. When does it actually come into focus? And, is this a project of settler science where initially, having embraced, as you say, the hyacinths, carnations, and hollyhocks, by the earlier 20th century, they are very fervently embracing fynbos as a sign of settler belonging. Okay, so all of these politics of plant belonging. So on then to Jules's paper, this wonderfully detailed and textured account of this important node in colonial Natal in the broader imperial project of research into tsetse fly and what used to be called sleeping sickness. Where are we? Okay, so if I can say one challenge always of this type of work is how to give more prominence to the role of Africans, routinely marginalized in archival and official sources. And in thinking about this issue, I was struck by the pictures of Kartolo that you showed, one in a group photo and one on his own. And in both images, he appears in a kind of uniform. And in looking at these photographs, I was reminded of Hlonipha Mokwena's work on Zulu policemen, or how this figure comes to be constructed. And she sees it as part of this larger pattern of what she calls war work, given the centuries of colonial warfare that is ongoing, so that Africans take up a range of positions, as irregulars, porters, auxiliaries, and so on, both to British colonial armies and in quasi-military roles in civilian life, like the policeman. I was also struck, as an aside, by the number of guns in the pictures that you showed, suggesting that one might think about Bruce's laboratory as an adjunct or wing of this war work. Hlonipha's work focuses a lot on uniforms, inevitably a sort of self-fashioned ensemble cobbled together from a range of different sources. And that seemed to be very apparent in the photos that you showed. And as she says, these forms of attire generally announce what the person aimed to become rather than what they were. So from this perspective, we might think of figures like Kartolo as undertaking a kind of frontier careering, shifting across, this range of jobs and positions in a situation of colonial expansion. So his prospects were, of course, much more constrained than the imperial careerists, but it could be useful to think of him and his colleagues as a kind of frontier careerist nonetheless, using the Bruces and their scientific work as an opportunity for self-fashioning. So in conclusion, just an Indian Ocean footnote to Jules's paper, I've recently been working on insects in archives and discovered that in the early 1900s, there was concern that sleeping sickness might travel to India via returning indentured laborers from East Africa. Also, imagine possibly that the flies themselves might travel embedded in straw and dung and so on. The issue, in fact, was raised in the British House of Commons in 1907, and it points to this very persistent idea of Africa, as a source of infection, especially in this case when combined with these very despised indentured laborers. So it takes us back to Giannamar's paper, and again, the sort of hierarchy of these Europe, Asia, Africa. In this case, Africa, the sort of bottom of the heap, threatening to contaminate India. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your really stimulating comments and your questions to push our research further. And just in organizational terms, I think we have around just under 10 minutes, so we can please, in the audience, do send questions if you want to the Q&A. Otherwise, I think Catherine, Jules, and I can very briefly give our thoughts on in response to your comments. And so if I can just very, very briefly begin, I think you've raised some really important points about problems in the historiography today that are replicating this hierarchy of cultures and of continents that are treating the Cape still, to some extent, and its history as one of the East Indies rather than one of so many enslaved West Africans and Mozambicans. I think, so I'm at the very start of my project. Actually, I'm starting this project in October. So I definitely want to talk more and see what kind of routes this can go down. I think for me, the most important thing will be balancing the global and the local perspective. Like how much, can one look out from the Cape? What is happening there in the 17th and early 18th centuries in terms of then the broader patterns of globalization that are being discussed in Europe and by also European agents in the East Indies. So, how can one privilege the Cape as this key space of encounter? And I think that's what I want to try and do. Oh, I see some questions as well, but let me pass on to Catherine now, and yeah.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for your comments, really insightful comments, and lots of great terms that I hadn't seen before, hadn't used before, which I think I'm going to start thinking about, especially phytocolonialism, which is one that I had not heard or had not considered, but I have been looking for some sort of plant-based word, trying to create your own language in a sense. And so maybe something like phytocolonialism is the way forward. I'm starting to move more into the late 19th century. My whole shtick in my PhD was like, we don't pay enough attention to the early 19th century, so that's what I'm going to do. So future work is going to start actually incorporating the late 19th century and the 20th century, which leads into your second point about sort of when does the Cape's biodiversity come into the clear? And I think really by the 1930s, 1940s, this is when we see South African based scientists starting to say they declare a Cape floral kingdom of its own. But I don't know yet to what extent that was accepted around the world. The Cape's biodiversity was then readily accepted from other scientists around the world. So that's something I'm going to start looking into, actually. And then I'll just respond to the quick question that I saw in the chat about the role of applying museum biocollections and indigenous ethnobotanic knowledge as a way to expand histories of science beyond its often textual-based focus. I mean, this is something that I've really been working on. I don't know that I'm doing it successfully yet, but I know that there are sort of like groups of people sort of starting to work on the ways in which we can start thinking about these two things together, but there's not quite any sort of concrete methodology or any way of doing this yet. I think we're all just kind of trying to first of all, get access to museum collections, which is a first hurdle, but then trying to think with the material in order to then uncover things that we didn't know before. I'm in the process of writing my book, and I'm trying to tease that out more and more, but I can't say that I have a concrete way forward with that. But thank you for your question. And then I'll pass on to Jules now.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for these wonderful, very, very helpful comments. To address your first question on Kartolo and the photographs, this paper has, well, it started out as one paper, so it's split into two now. And this one is kind of trying to focus on particularly the workings of the scientific operation, the labor infrastructures behind it, the different epistemology that kind of fused together in the early history of trypanosomiasis. I think I need a third paper to focus on these photographs, because Bruce there's about in the Wellcome Library 100 or 150 of these photographs, and they provide just like a really remarkable view onto just a sort of photographic representations and relationships between scientific experts and Zulu people in the region. And I haven't had the space to go into this stuff as nearly as much as I want to. So I think I need to plan another paper engaging much more with the literature you've suggested, in order to sort of trace what exactly they were getting out of this, and the idea of a kind of frontier career is very helpful in that sense. And then on the second point about India, yes. So in India, there was, in fact, this was established by Bruce. There is an allied disease called Sura, which is a cattle disease that's also spread by a slightly different trypanosome. So there was much concern in even this period that if these things were moved around, or that there was a potential for this to spread to other regions. And this particularly, this doesn't just happen between South Asia and South Africa, but it's also between South African borders, because in 1910, they started worrying that different forms, so that sleeping sickness, which affects humans, whereas Nagana only affects cattle, will cross the border from Mozambique because there's labor connections, and they think people are going to harbor these parasites and then get bitten by the local tsetse flies and then spread to animals and establish a new reservoir. And I think there was similar concerns about this happening with India. So I think that's another element to the story that I need to look into as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, and just Jules, I think there was also a question for you in the Q&A. So I can read it out. A question on the mythologization of the frontier scientist and the erasure of African labor and expertise. It struck me as very similar to processes we see in European travel narratives across the 19th century, where travelers frequently emphasize their individual experiences as explorers and their supposed discoveries, while omitting huge support structure of porters, guides, translators, and guards. And this African travel industry often shaped the routes open to European travelers, shuttling them along established trading or slaving routes. But in most travel accounts, these local knowledges were flattened out or omitted entirely. So I wondered if you could speak to the crossovers between these mythologizations. But we are out of time, unfortunately. But thank you all so much for your papers, and Isabel for your wonderful comments. And thank you to the audience. And yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Brian, if I can find your email address, I'll answer you over email.